In this video, I'll show you both a recipe to paint a Krieg army in no time, as well as how I constructed this strange diorama, pointing out any mistakes I'd made so you don't make them yourself. Starting with the models, the process was a series of zenithal highlights through the airbrush, changing the angle and color mix. First, base coating the model with a darker blue, before proceeding to airbrush a 3:1 mix of dark and light blue respectively from a 45-degree angle, followed by a 1:1 mix and a 1:3 mix, increasing the angle of spray every time, until finally spraying the pure field blue straight from above. In case of not counting with an airbrush, you can resort to dry brushing, starting with an overall first highlight and for the lighter second and third reducing the painting area, for example from the belt up and from the chest up, this way creating a similar gradient of color on the coat. Moving on, I base coated each corresponding detail. The only color to bring attention to here is the previously used field blue, which while used for the final highlight, it was still far from achieving its full opacity due to the dilution required to airbrush it, so I used it to paint the sleeves and the bottomed up parts of the coat. As I said in my army painting tips video, I kept the color quantity as low as possible, picking a single leather color as well as a single metallic. The bulk of an army will always be looked at as a whole, so there's no need to stress about small details as with single characters or centerpieces. With everything base coated, I stuck my models to some spare bases to make washing them easier. I used an oil wash as I often do when working with many models, mixing some black and brown with some white spirits. I was looking for something thin and low staining, mostly to get in on the recesses. Still, as with any oil wash, I gave the model 30 minutes to allow the solvent to evaporate before removing any excess wash on the raised details with a makeup sponge. If you'd like an in-depth look at oil washes and their advantages over conventional washes, look no further than my oil wash masterclass linked above. When planning, I took into account what the golden angle of each model would be, so to have them properly visible from the point of view the diorama would be displayed. The diagonal trench, for example, allowed me to place the gunners one next to the other without them obstructing each other from the viewer. Once I had everything planned out, I transferred the design to an MDF board and blocked out the rough shapes with styrofoam. Since I don't have a wire cutter to make everything to size, I had to lift up the ground since the trenches were a bit too deep for my models. I then cleaned off any excess foam on the edges and filled the gaps with gesso, which I then sanded down and primed. In hindsight, I should have just covered the sides with plasticard or thinner MDF and cut the trench aperture to size. Having hacked at the no man's land a little to avoid a completely flat ground, as well as shaping the stairs into the trenches, I mixed PVA, sand, water and black paint to create a texture paste, with which I sealed the styrofoam. But halfway through the process, I swapped to simply coating the ground with diluted PVA and sprinkling the sand over it. Working the mix with the spatula or even with a brush was just too slow going. While the sand was drying, I glued corrugated cardboard which I'll then paint to be metal sheets. Using different widths of balsa wood, I added planks on the bottom and sprinkled dirt while the glue was still wet to fill in the gaps. Using the same dirt plus glue and PVA, I filled in the gaps on the metal sheets and the ground to blend everything together. The final detail before priming were some sandbags I made by rolling down some air dry clay. After an overall coat of black, I painted the ground, sandbags, metallic sheets and planks with their corresponding color using craft paints. For the ground, a dry brush of a lighter tone made all the texture pop. I didn't bother with a super precise paint job since I plan to use pigments to do all the heavy lifting. A while back, I talked about homemade pigments. These are made simply by grinding down some pastel chalks. Pigments are an amazing basing tool, but when looking to make a diorama this size, I can get more than enough pigment for 1/10 of the price, while the result is pretty much the same. I first broke it into pieces before mashing it down with a rolling pin. Diluting a reddish pigment with 1 part isopropyl alcohol and 2 parts distilled water, I applied this wash-like mix over all of the ground, and having it diluted even more inside the trenches. Once dry, I'll get a dusty finish which will accumulate in the recesses and pockets. One final detail I added was some barbed wire. To make it, I began by using my pin vise to entwine some wire. To add the barbs, I took another piece of wire which was maybe 1/3 longer and looped it around. I then secured the loops with superglue, before cutting the center of the loops to only leave the points sticking out. Only thing left was to give it shape by coiling it around the stick. I looped the barbed wire in a cross section and glued it in place alongside the models. In order to tie the models to the scene, I used a darker pigment to both darken the recesses as well as dirty the models' boots. Thank you for watching till the end. I hope you found the video entertaining and that you got something useful out of it.